His dog brought home a leopard. What happened next shocked everyone. That spring, sunlight filtered through thin layers of cloud, casting a soft glow over the weathered wooden roof of a small cabin nestled deep in the Oregon forest. The light seemed almost hesitant, as if uncertain whether to fully commit to warming the earth below. Elias Turner sat on his front porch, nursing his third cup of coffee since dawn, watching the steam rise and dissipate into the cool morning air. The silence around him was profound, not the uncomfortable silence of an empty house, but the living silence of a forest breathing. His fingers traced the worn edges of an old photograph tucked into his shirt pocket. Margaret's smile looked back at him, frozen in that moment 2 summers ago when she'd insisted they needed a dog. He'd protested then, arguing that their nomadic lifestyle following wildlife photography assignments around the globe wasn't suited for pets. Now, 2 years after her funeral, that same dog Zephyr was padding through the underbrush beyond the garden, his thick coat gleaming silver-white in the dappled sunlight. Elias Turner had once been a name whispered with reverence in the circles of National Geographic and Wildlife Photography magazine. His lens had captured the raw essence of Siberian tigers stalking through snow, the ancient wisdom in an elephant matriarch's eyes, the fierce tenderness of a lioness with her cubs. But that life felt like it belonged to someone else now, someone who had believed the world still held wonder worth chasing. The cameras that once traveled continents now gathered dust in his study, their silence a testament to dreams abandoned. The forest had become his sanctuary and his prison. Here, among the Douglas firs and western hemlocks, he could exist without pretense, without the need to capture beauty for others to consume. Margaret had understood this need for solitude even before he did. The cabin had been her idea, purchased during one of their brief returns to the States, a refuge she'd insisted they'd need someday. "You'll thank me for this place," she'd said, standing where he now sat, her hands gesturing toward the endless canopy of green. "When the world gets too loud, when your heart needs somewhere to rest." She'd been right, as always, but she hadn't lived to see him retreat here permanently, and hadn't seen him turn his back on assignments that once thrilled him, hadn't witnessed the slow transformation from celebrated photographer to hermit. Zephyr had been Margaret's final gift, delivered 3 months before the cancer took her. A Siberian husky puppy with eyes like Arctic ice and in spirit that seemed untamable. Elias had resented the dog initially, another responsibility when he could barely manage his own grief, another living thing that would inevitably leave him. But Zephyr had worn down his defenses with persistent affection and an uncanny ability to sense when the silence became too heavy. The dog possessed an intelligence that sometimes unnerved Elias. Zephyr seemed to understand that his human needed routines to anchor himself to each day. Every morning, the dog would nudge Elias awake with a cold nose against his hand, then wait patiently by the door until his master emerged for their walk. He never strayed far when Elias was struggling with dark moods, but gave him space when solitude was what he craved. It was as if Margaret had somehow infused the animal with an understanding of human fragility. Now, 3 years old and fully grown, Zephyr had claimed the forest as his domain. He knew every deer trail, every stream crossing, every hollow, where interesting scents lingered. Elias often wondered what the dog thought about during his solo explorations, whether he missed the companionship of his own kind or if the partnership with one grieving human was enough. The sound of rushing water had grown louder over the past week. April's rains had been relentless, turning the usually gentle creek behind the cabin into a torrent. Elias could hear it even now, a constant rumble that spoke of snow melt and saturated earth. The weather reports warned of potential flooding, but up here in the mountains, such warnings felt abstract, distant from the immediate reality of morning coffee and a dog's wandering. On this particular morning, something felt different. The air carried a tension that made the hair on Elias's arm stand up, a pressure that seemed to press against his chest. The birds, usually vocal in the early hours, had fallen silent. Even the omnipresent sound of the swollen creek seemed muffled, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Zephyr emerged from the tree line, his usual confident gait replaced by something more cautious. The dog's ears were pricked forward, his head tilted in the way that indicated he'd encountered something unusual. He approached the porch, but didn't settle into his customary spot at Elias's feet. Instead, he remained standing, his ice-blue eyes fixed on the forest behind him. "What is it?" "Boy," Elias asked, setting down his coffee cup. "Find something interesting out there." Before Zephyr could respond in his usual way, a head tilt or a soft whine, the sound hit them. It was like the earth itself was groaning, a deep rumble that seemed to come from the very bones of the mountain. The coffee cup rattled against its saucer, and somewhere in the distance, Elias could hear the sharp crack of trees snapping. Both man and dog froze, listening to the terrible symphony of moving earth and breaking wood. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt much longer. And when it finally subsided, the silence that followed was different from before. This was the silence of aftermath, of a landscape suddenly and irrevocably changed. Elias stood slowly, his photographer's instincts awakening after years of dormancy. He'd witnessed natural disasters before, had learned to read the signs that preceded them and recognize their wake. This hadn't been an earthquake. He would have felt the ground moving beneath his feet. This was something else, something localized and immediate. "Landslide," he said aloud, the word heavy with implication. Zephyr whined softly, his tail low, sensing his master's concern. Together, they walked around the cabin toward the back slope where the sound had originated. What Elias saw there confirmed his fears, and then some. The entire hillside had collapsed, carrying with it centuries-old trees, tons of granite boulders, and enough mud and debris to completely block the narrow access road that connected his property to the outside world. The devastation was absolute. Where once a well-maintained trail had wound its way down to the main road 3 miles below, there was now only a chaotic jumble of earth and timber. The creek, its course altered by the slide, had formed a new path through the debris, creating an impassable swamp where solid ground used to be. Elias pulled out his cell phone, grateful that the recent installation of a signal booster still allowed him minimal connectivity. He scrolled through his contacts until he found Tom Abernathy's number. Tom had been a fixture in these mountains for over 30 years, first as a forest ranger, then as a private consultant for wilderness rescue operations. If anyone would know how to assess this situation, it would be Tom. The phone rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. "Tom here." "Tom, it's Elias Turner up on Cascade Ridge. We've had a major slide up here, completely cut off my access road." There was a pause, followed by the sound of rustling papers. "Jesus, Elias, I've been monitoring the water levels all morning. How bad is it?" "Bad. I'm looking at maybe 200 yards of debris, probably 20 feet deep in places. Trees, boulders. The whole hillside came down. Anyone hurt? Just me and Zephyr up here. And we're fine. But I'm effectively trapped until this gets cleared." Tom's voice took on a more serious tone. "Listen to me carefully. Elias, a slide like that isn't just about blocked roads. It's disrupted everything in a 5-mile radius. Wildlife territories have been destroyed, water sources redirected, then sites collapsed. You're going to have confused and displaced animals wandering through areas they've never seen before." "I understand." "No, I don't think you do. I'm talking about predators. Elias, bears coming down from higher elevations, cougars whose hunting grounds just got buried, maybe even wolves if they've been ranging this far south. These animals are going to be desperate, disoriented, and potentially dangerous." Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What are you recommending?" "Keep Zephyr close. I mean it, don't let him wander like he usually does. Stock up on whatever supplies you have. Secure your cabin, and wait for the recovery crews. I'll try to get a team up there, but with the road blocked, it's going to take time, maybe a week, possibly more. How much more? Depends on the weather. If we get more rain, it could shift again. If the new creek course undermines the slide, we might be looking at a month before it's safe to bring heavy equipment in." After ending the call, Elias stood looking at the devastation with new eyes. What had seemed like an inconvenience now revealed itself as something far more serious. He was isolated in a way he'd never been before, cut off not just from human help, but potentially in the path of every displaced creature within miles. He called to Zephyr, who had been investigating the edge of the debris field. The dog looked up, his expression almost guilty, and Elias realized with growing unease that his companion's wanderlust might have become a liability overnight. "Come on, boy, we need to talk." Back at the cabin, Elias began taking inventory. His emergency supplies were adequate but not generous enough canned goods for perhaps 2 weeks. A gravity-fed water filter connected to a spring that appeared unaffected by the slide. A backup generator with fuel for a few days of power. His medical kit was basic, designed more for treating cuts and scrapes than serious injuries. The radio could reach emergency frequencies but depended on weather conditions. Most concerning was his ammunition supply. Elias owned a Sensen 3006 rifle, a necessity in these mountains, but had only 2 boxes of cartridges. He'd never considered the possibility of needing to defend himself against multiple encounters with desperate wildlife. As he completed his assessment, Zephyr paced restlessly by the door. The dog's usual routine involved a long morning exploration, and being confined to the immediate area was clearly causing him distress. His whines grew more frequent, and he began pawing at the door with increasing urgency. "I know you want out, but Tom's right. It's not safe out there anymore." But Zephyr was not a dog easily dissuaded. When Elias turned away to organize his supplies, the husky slipped through the back door that had been left slightly ajar. By the time Elias noticed his absence, Zephyr had already vanished into the forest, his silver form disappearing among the shadows and green light. "Zephyr," Elias called, his voice echoing off the surrounding trees. "Zephyr, come back." Only silence answered him. Elias grabbed his jacket and headed after the dog, following what he hoped was Zephyr's path into the woods. The forest felt different now, charged with an energy that made every shadow suspect, every sound potentially threatening. Birds that should have been singing remained silent, and even the usual rustle of small creatures in the underbrush was absent. He followed what appeared to be fresh paw prints in the soft earth, calling Zephyr's name periodically, but receiving no response. The trail led deeper into the forest, away from the slide area, and toward a section of woods Elias rarely visited. Here, ancient trees formed a canopy so dense that little direct sunlight reached the forest floor. Moss carpeted everything in shades of emerald and jade, creating a world that felt both ancient and alive. After an hour of searching, Elias was forced to admit defeat. Zephyr had vanished as completely as if the forest had swallowed him, and continuing to chase after him would only result in Elias himself becoming lost. With growing worry gnawing at his chest, he returned to the cabin to wait, hoping his companion's intelligence and survival instincts would bring him home safely. Meanwhile, deep in the maze of fallen timber and muddy earth created by the landslide, Zephyr followed a scent unlike any he'd encountered before. His powerful nose, capable of detecting odors at concentrations nearly imperceptible to humans, had locked onto a trail that spoke of injury, fear, and something wild that didn't belong in these woods. The scent was layered and complex, the metallic tang of blood, the musky essence of a large predator, the acrid smell of fear, and underneath it all, something that reminded him of the exotic animal documentaries Elias sometimes watched on winter evenings. It was the smell of faraway places, of savannas and jungles, of creatures that belonged to a different world entirely. Zephyr picked his way carefully through the debris, his paws finding purchase on surfaces made treacherous by mud and shifted earth. He paused frequently to test the air, adjusting his direction as the scent trail wound through the chaos. Once, he heard a sound that made his hackles rise, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. But the scent trail led toward the sound, not away from it, and something deep in his canine consciousness urged him forward rather than back. He found her in a hollow formed by 3 fallen trees, their trunks creating a natural shelter that was partially concealed by torn earth and tangled vegetation. At first glance, she was simply another shadow among many, her spotted coat blending seamlessly with the play of light and dark in the forest debris. But as Zephyr approached, moving with the careful deliberation of a predator himself, the shadow resolved into something extraordinary. She was a leopard, though Zephyr had no name for what he saw. His dog's mind simply registered large cat, injured, afraid, alone. She was perhaps 3 years old, still young enough to retain some of the proportions of adolescence, but old enough to possess the lean muscle and alert intelligence of a mature predator. Her coat, despite being matted with mud and debris, showed the distinctive rosette pattern that marked her species. But it was her eyes that held Zephyr's attention, amber gold, and filled with a wariness that spoke of recent trauma. Kaya, though neither Zephyr nor Elias would know her name for some time, had spent the last 3 years of her life in conditions that would have broken a weaker spirit. She'd been born in captivity. Her mother, a former circus performer who'd been retired to a roadside attraction in southern Oregon. The facility had operated in legal gray areas, its owner more interested in profit than proper animal care. The enclosures were barely adequate, the medical care minimal, and the environmental enrichment non-existent. For Kaya, the world had consisted of a concrete floored cage, barely 20 feet square, chain-link walls topped with razor wire, and a steady parade of visitors who pointed and stared but never truly saw her. She'd learned to associate humans with the harsh clang of metal doors, the sting of tranquilizer darts, and the constant stress of being on display. Her natural behaviors had been suppressed through confinement, her hunting instincts dulled by a diet of pre-killed prey thrown through the bars. The landslide had changed everything in a matter of minutes. The rushing water and debris had torn through the facility's inadequate fencing like it was made of paper. In the chaos that followed, as emergency responders focused on evacuating human staff and visitors, several animals had found themselves free for the first time in their lives. Some, the domestic animals and farm stock, had been quickly recaptured. Others, including a pair of wolves and a black bear, had vanished into the wilderness, with instincts still sharp enough to ensure their survival. Kaya had fallen somewhere between these extremes. She possessed the physical capabilities of her species, the strength, agility, and senses that had made leopards successful predators across multiple continents. But 3 years of captivity had eroded her confidence in those abilities. When the fence came down and she found herself free, her first instinct had been to find another enclosed space, another boundary to define her world. She'd fled into the forest not from a drive toward freedom, but from overwhelming fear. The sounds, smells, and sensations of the natural world had assaulted senses that had grown accustomed to the predictable monotony of captivity. Every bird call had been a potential threat, every rustling leaf a reason for alarm. By the time she'd finally stopped running, exhaustion and an injured hind leg had forced her to seek shelter in the hollow where Zephyr found her. Now, faced with another potential threat in the form of a large dog, Kaya's response was neither fight nor flight. Instead, and she pressed herself deeper into the hollow, her amber eyes fixed on the silver-white form, picking its way toward her through the debris. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her muscles coiled with the tension of an animal preparing for whatever might come next. Zephyr paused 10 feet away from the hollow, his own instincts warring with each other. Every gene inherited from his wolf ancestors told him he was looking at a predator, a potential competitor or threat that should be avoided or driven away. But something else, something that might have been empathy or simple curiosity, held him in place. The injured creature before him triggered the same protective instincts that made him stay close to Elias during his darkest moods. For several minutes, the two animals regarded each other in silence. Kaya's breathing gradually slowed as it became apparent that the dog meant no immediate harm. Zephyr lowered himself into a lying position, his front paws extended, his head resting between them in a posture that was unmistakably non-threatening. It was the position he assumed when he wanted to indicate play or peaceful intent to other dogs, though he'd never used it to communicate with a wild predator before. The gesture had an unexpected effect. Something in Kaya's posture relaxed slightly, and for the first time since the fence had come down, she made a sound that wasn't born from fear or pain. It was a soft chuff, barely audible, the sort of vocalization leopards use to indicate calm acknowledgement. Encouraged, Zephyr rose slowly and took a single step closer. When Kaya didn't retreat further into the hollow, he took another step, then another. until he was close enough to extend his nose toward her. The scent of her filled his nostrils, wild and foreign, but also somehow familiar, carrying undertones that reminded him of the house cats that sometimes wandered near Elias's cabin. Kaya watched this approach with the intensity of a creature whose survival had always depended on reading threats accurately. But as the dog's nose approached hers, something extraordinary happened. Instead of striking out with claws or teeth, instead of hissing or growling, she extended her own head slightly, allowing their noses to touch. The contact lasted only a moment, but it was enough to establish something unprecedented between them. In that brief touch, two different species acknowledged each other not as predator and prey, not as competitors, but as something else entirely. What that something was would take time to define. But in that moment, it was enough that it existed at all. The sky, which had been threatening rain all morning, finally fulfilled its promise. The first drops were large and cold, striking the canopy above with audible force before filtering down to the forest floor. Within minutes, the gentle pattering had intensified into a steady downpour, and by the time 10 minutes had passed, it had become the kind of deluge that turns dry creek beds into torrents and forest paths into muddy streams. Zephyr looked up at the darkening sky, then back at Kaya, who had pressed herself even deeper into the hollow as the rain began to penetrate her makeshift shelter. Her injured leg was clearly causing her pain, and her coat, already matted with debris, was becoming soaked through. The hollow that had seemed adequate for temporary shelter was proving insufficient against the intensity of the storm. Without conscious decision, Zephyr began to move. He disappeared from Kaya's sight, leaving her alone in the hollow with only the sound of falling rain for company. For a moment, she felt the familiar panic of abandonment, the learned helplessness that years of captivity had taught her. But before the feeling could fully take hold, the dog reappeared, dragging something behind him. It was an old wool blanket, one that Elias used for picnics and outdoor photography sessions. Zephyr had remembered seeing it on the cabin's back porch and had somehow intuited that it might be useful. The trek back through the forest with the unwieldy blanket had been challenging, but he'd persevered with the single-minded determination that characterized his breed. Getting the blanket to Kaya proved to be an exercise in interspecies communication. Zephyr couldn't simply throw it to her. He lacked the opposable thumbs and arm strength such a gesture would require. Instead, he had to somehow convince her to help him arrange it in a way that would provide better shelter for both of them. He began by dragging the blanket as close to the hollow as possible, then backing away to give Kaya space to investigate. She emerged cautiously, favoring her injured leg, and sniffed the fabric carefully. The blanket carried scents of human and dog, of soap and fabric softener, of a domestic world completely foreign to her experience. But it was also warm and dry. And as the rain continued to intensify, practicality overcame caution. What followed was an awkward but ultimately successful collaboration. Kaya used her claws to grip one edge of the blanket while Zephyr pulled from the other side, gradually working the fabric over the opening of the hollow until it formed a crude but effective roof. Then, in a moment that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier, both animals settled beneath their shared shelter. The warmth generated by their combined body heat transformed the hollow into something approaching comfort. Kaya lay on her side, her injured leg extended to avoid putting pressure on it, while Zephyr curled into a typical husky sleeping position, his thick coat providing additional insulation. Neither animal slept deeply. They were still too unfamiliar with each other for complete relaxation, but both managed to doze intermittently as the storm raged around their shelter. Outside, the rain continued through the night, occasionally punctuated by the distant rumble of thunder or the crack of another tree succumbing to saturated soil. The forest was in turmoil, streams overflowing their banks, small animals seeking whatever shelter they could find, and larger predators moving restlessly through territories made unfamiliar by the earlier landslide. But in the hollow beneath the fallen trees, two unlikely companions had found something that transcended the chaos around them. It wasn't friendship yet that would take time to develop. It wasn't even trust, really. Though the beginnings of that precious commodity were present, what they had found was something simpler and more profound. The recognition that in a world suddenly full of dangers, they were safer together than apart. Dawn came slowly, filtered through layers of cloud and the lingering moisture of the storm. The rain had finally stopped, but the forest dripped with the accumulated precipitation of the long night. Every surface gleamed with water, and the air was thick with the rich scent of wet earth and growing things. Zephyr was the first to wake, alerted by the sound of something large moving through the forest nearby. His ears pricked forward as he identified the sounds: heavy footsteps, breaking branches, a human voice calling his name. Elias was looking for him, and the worry in that familiar voice made Zephyr's tail wag despite the unusual circumstances. But waking brought a new dilemma. How could he respond to his master's call without abandoning the injured creature who had shared his shelter through the night? How could he explain, in the limited vocabulary available to a dog, that he had found something extraordinary in the forest? Something that needed help. Kaya stirred as well, made nervous by the approaching sounds of a human. Her experience with Elias's species had been universally negative, and even in her weakened state, her muscles tensed with the urge to flee, but her injured leg wouldn't support her weight properly. And in any case, Zephyr's calm presence seemed to suggest that this particular human might be different from the one she remembered. The decision was made for both of them when Elias appeared at the edge of the debris field, his worried face scanning the area where he'd heard movement. What he saw when his gaze fell upon the makeshift shelter beneath the fallen trees was so far beyond his expectations that for a moment he wondered if he might still be dreaming. Zephyr was rising from beneath a familiar wool blanket, his tail wagging tentatively as he recognized his master. But beside him, also emerging from the shelter, was something that simply couldn't be there. Elias blinked hard, rubbed his eyes, and looked again, but the image remained unchanged. "Zephyr," he called softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What have you done?" The dog whined softly and took a few steps toward Elias, then looked back at Kaya, who remained partially concealed beneath the blanket. It was clear that Zephyr was torn between his loyalty to his human and his concern for his new companion. Elias approached slowly, every instinct screaming that he was walking toward a potentially lethal predator, while his rational mind insisted that what he was seeing was impossible. Leopards didn't live in Oregon forests. They didn't take shelter with domestic dogs. They didn't. But as he drew closer, the evidence of his eyes became undeniable. The creature watching him from the shelter was indeed a leopard, young and injured, but unmistakably real. Her amber eyes tracked his movement with the wariness of a wild animal, but she made no move to flee or attack. Instead, she seemed to be taking her cues from Zephyr, who continued to move between his master and his new friend as if trying to facilitate some sort of introduction. "Easy, girl," Elias found himself saying, though he wasn't sure if he was addressing Kaya or trying to calm his own nerves. "Nobody's going to hurt you." His photographer's eye, dormant for so long, suddenly awakened with the intensity of a searchlight. The composition before him was extraordinary, the juxtaposition of domestic and wild, the interplay of silver-white fur against golden-spotted coat, the obvious bond that had formed between two species that should have been natural enemies. But more than the visual impact, there was something in the scene that spoke to deeper truths about connection, compassion, and the unexpected ways that healing could occur. Elias pulled out his cell phone, not to call for help, not yet, but to document what he was seeing. The photos he took that morning would later become famous. But in the moment, they were simply a reflex, a return to the habits that had once defined his professional life. As he photographed them, Kaya began to relax slightly. The clicking of the camera shutter was not threatening in the way she'd expected human sounds to be. There was something almost rhythmic about it, and the man behind the device maintained a respectful distance. Most importantly, Zephyr remained calm, his body language continuing to suggest that this human was safe. After several minutes of observation and photography, Elias made a decision that would change all of their lives. Instead of calling authorities immediately, instead of attempting to separate the unlikely pair, he chose to honor the bond that had clearly formed between them. "All right," he said aloud, addressing both animals, though he knew only Zephyr would understand the words. Let's get you both somewhere warm and dry. We'll figure out what comes next after that. The journey back to the cabin was slow and careful. Kaya's injured leg made walking difficult, and she was still wary of Elias, despite Zephyr's obvious trust in him. Several times, she stopped entirely, pressing herself against trees or fallen logs as if seeking escape routes. But each time, Zephyr would return to her side, his presence serving as both encouragement and reassurance. Elias found himself speaking to her as they walked, his voice low and soothing in the way that had once calmed frightened animals in photography blinds around the world. He told her about the cabin, about the warm fire waiting there, about how Zephyr had learned to trust him and how she might learn the same thing. Whether she understood the words didn't matter. The tones seemed to have a calming effect. By the time they reached the cabin, word of mouth had begun to spread among the scattered population of the surrounding mountains. Tom Abernathy's radio crackled with reports of strange animal sightings, and by noon, he had connected enough dots to realize that the illegal animal facility destroyed by the landslide had been harboring more exotic creatures than their permits indicated. When his phone rang and he saw Elias's number on the display, Tom almost didn't answer. He was coordinating search and rescue efforts for missing animals and didn't have time for updates on blocked roads. But something made him take the call, and what he heard on the other end of the line left him speechless. "Tom, I need you to sit down for this." "I'm already sitting." "Elias, what's wrong now?" "Nothing's wrong." "Exactly. But I need to tell you something, and you're not going to believe it." "Try me." Zephyr brought home a leopard. There was a long pause, followed by a sound that might have been laughter or might have been choking. "Elias, I know you've been isolated up there, and I know grief can make people see things. I'm not hallucinating." "Tom, I'm looking at her right now. Young female leopard, injured back leg, currently sleeping in my tool shed with my dog." "That's impossible. I've got photos." Another pause, longer this time. When Tom spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming the professional tone he used during emergency situations. "Elias, if what you're telling me is true, you could be in serious danger. Wild leopards are not pets. They're apex predators with the strength to kill a human being without effort." "She's not wild." "Tom, well, she is, but she's not. I think she's one of the animals from that illegal facility that got destroyed. She's been in captivity, probably for years. Her behavior, it's not what you'd expect from a wild leopard." Tom was quiet for a long time, processing this information against what he knew about the situation. Reports had been coming in all morning about missing exotic animals, but no one had mentioned a leopard. Still, if such an animal had been at the facility illegally, its absence might not have been reported. "All right," Tom said finally. "I'm coming up there. I don't know how I'm going to manage it with the road blocked, but I'm coming. In the meantime, do not approach that animal. Do not try to feed it or interact with it in any way. And for God's sake, keep Zephyr away from it." "Tom, that's just it. I can't keep Zephyr away from her. They've bonded. She follows him around, sleeps next to him, acts like he's her packmate or something. I've never seen anything like it. Jesus Christ. Elias, you're describing something that goes against every piece of animal behavior knowledge I've accumulated in 30 years of working in the wilderness. I know how it sounds, but you need to see this for yourself." After ending the call, Elias sat on his porch and watched the most remarkable scene unfolding in his back garden. Zephyr had led Kaya to the small wooden shed where he sometimes took afternoon naps when the weather was particularly hot. The structure had been intended for storing garden tools and outdoor equipment, but it was dry, relatively warm, and isolated enough to provide the sense of security that Kaya seemed to need. The leopard had claimed one corner of the shed, arranging some old tarps into a makeshift bed. But rather than guarding this territory jealously, as wildcats typically do, she seemed content to share the space with Zephyr. The dog had established his own sleeping spot nearby, close enough to provide companionship but far enough away to avoid crowding his new friend. What fascinated Elias was the way they communicated. Zephyr would approach Kaya slowly, his body language clearly indicating peaceful intent. She would respond with subtle movements of her head or tail, acknowledging his presence without alarm. When she wanted to be alone, she would turn her back to him and curl into a tight ball. And Zephyr would immediately respect this signal, giving her space while remaining nearby. But it was their play behavior that truly amazed him. Despite her injury, Kaya had begun to engage in gentle play with Zephyr, swatting at his tail with sheathed claws or pouncing playfully when he walked past her corner of the shed. These were not the calculated movements of a predator, but the behavior of a young animal rediscovering joy in interaction. Elias found himself reaching for his camera equipment for the first time in months. The professional photographer in him recognized that he was witnessing something unprecedented, something that needed to be documented, not just for its novelty, but for its potential importance to understanding interspecies relationships. He spent the afternoon photographing their interactions, noting the subtle ways they had learned to accommodate each other's needs and communicate across the species barrier. When Kaya grew tired, she would rest her head against Zephyr's flank, and the dog would remain perfectly still until she was ready to move again. When Zephyr wanted to go outside, he would nudge Kaya gently and wait for her response before leaving her alone. By evening, Elias had filled 2 memory cards with images and several hours of video footage. But more than documenting an unusual friendship, the process of photography had awakened something in him that had been dormant since Margaret's death. For the first time in years, he felt the familiar excitement of capturing something meaningful, something that mattered beyond his own grief and isolation. Tom Abernathy arrived the next morning, having hiked 5 miles through forest and over the debris field to reach Elias's cabin. He was muddy, exhausted, and skeptical about what he expected to find. His 30 years of experience with wildlife had taught him that the most extraordinary claims usually had the most ordinary explanations. But when Elias led him quietly to the shed and pointed through the partially open door, Tom's skepticism evaporated immediately. There, sleeping peacefully in a patch of morning sunlight, were a Siberian husky and a young leopard, their breathing synchronized, their bodies positioned in the way that pack animals arrange themselves for mutual warmth and security. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom whispered, his voice filled with wonder rather than disbelief. For several minutes, both men watched in silence as the unlikely pair slept. Occasionally, one or the other would shift position, but they never